Some of the best games out there are the ones that demonstrate innovation. One innovative idea could place such an influence on the industry that they are still used 30 years later. In the early 90s, Megalomania and Sid Meier's Civilization were among the first video games to introduce something called an acyclic graph. Just for some context, these games are largely focused around the technological advancement of cities in order to build a powerful empire. At the start of the game, we, the player, would typically begin with a few tech points to immediately assign to a variety of industries. Each industry possessing a tech point will grow at an accelerated rate, thus tailoring a playstyle, influencing tactics, and providing us with a greater sense of agency. This obviously produces a constant internal battle, where we need to decide where we should be dedicating our resources. Should we play it safe and distribute the tech points evenly, or should we take a risk and see what happens if we allow one or two specific areas to thrive? If what I'm describing sounds at all familiar, you've likely played one of the hundreds of games released in the last 30 years to utilise the mechanic known as the skill tree. But while many embrace the skill tree as the roots of well-designed progression systems, is it possible that it's begun to wither and expire under the weight of its own immense growth? The customization of our character's appearance tends to take centre stage among the AAA gaming industry these days. Tweaking even the smallest detail to line up with whatever catwalk model or total abomination that we have in mind is seen by many as a fundamental element in the character creation process.
That's the face I fell in love with.
But building our very own bespoke character has far more depth to it than just beautifying an avatar. Following the early days of real-time strategy, the roots of the skill tree mechanic grew, and with it so did its influence. It's become something of an expectation for RPGs to adorn the skill tree mantle. It's really quite strange that simply attributing a value next to traits such as agility, strength, and intelligence has a profound way of making us feel like we are immersed in an entirely unique experience. If I focus on building a stealth class this time, I can create a tank build for my next playthrough. A thought process shared by many of us, I'm sure. This is one of the standout advantages of the skill tree mechanic. Being offered an alternative method to completing a game offers enormous replay value, and depending on how well these varying approaches are executed, it's possible to add countless hours to a game's lifespan. Of course, where RPGs are concerned, they are and always have been pretty large in scope. So what would happen if the skill tree mechanic found its way into other genres? For the record, I'm under no illusions that creating a well-structured skill tree is easy. The combination of multiple abilities needs to prioritize balance above all else, and this can take immense time and resources to perfect. But even when placed under minor scrutiny, the benefits that developers can reap are numerous. By simply factoring in the replay value alone, it offers developers ample opportunities to produce shorter games under the guise of larger scale. They can create more intimate experiences that last maybe only a few hours, but feel completely different each time across several playthroughs. A shorter runtime would also minimize lethargy and combat the issue of players giving up before reaching the game's conclusion. At the risk of stating the obvious, all three games showcased are colossal in scale. Something tells me the inclusion of skill trees has only increased the size of games exponentially. So, games not fitting the RPG archetype have also adopted the skill tree mechanic, or at least a variation of it. Even if you've only played a handful of open world adventure games released in the last decade, you've probably encountered this style of skill tree before. After all, it seems to form the backbone of many games' progression systems. One aspect that I see present among the vast majority of those progression systems is the feeling that we're not really constructing a unique character. Instead, it feels more like we're completing a checklist. It's not overtly mentioned outside the obligatory trophies and achievements, but it almost feels like there's an underlying objective to unlock every skill. This is quite the departure from building a specific class in an RPG. While this isn't inherently a bad thing, it does mean that the implementation is less about shaping a character to the player's preferences and more about molding the character to the developer's script. Again, that's not necessarily a criticism. However, as with all things, moderation is key. Unfortunately, such regular use of skill trees has led to the mechanic being somewhat standardized, and that's not a good thing. Worse still, it's potentially stifled new, exciting and daring innovative game design. How does one create a sense of character progression in a game? Simple, experience points and a skill tree. It's such a reliable solution. To add one final nail in the coffin, I believe that the general gaming population is fairly ambivalent towards skill trees. Most would agree that they are efficient and effective, and there's no real need to reinvent the wheel. At face value, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Ghost of Tsushima is just another AAA adventure game that borrows and steals all of its ideas from the standard model behaviour of its contemporaries. It has a large open world, occasional minigames, and there are small, manageable bands of hostiles peppering the landscape to satiate any hunger for combat. Needless to say, we are also presented with the familiar skill trees. But beneath the facade, the game offers some very interesting design choices that, while perhaps not earth-shattering, do a great job at circumventing some of the tropes that are all too common within the industry. For example, there is no minimap, and instead we must follow the wind to find our objectives. The world is also absent of dozens of towers to reveal the map, instead this is all done organically through exploration. But let's go back and readdress those skill trees. Throughout the frankly stunning island of Tsushima, we can find musicians that can regale us with mythical tales of armor, equipment, and long-forgotten combat techniques. Each mythical tale encompasses a short but fairly engaging exploration process of finding and uncovering the truth. As you've probably already surmised, the completion of any of these mythical tales questlines grants us with a reward, most frequently a skill or an ability. What I find commendable is that the developers, Sucker Punch Studios, chose not to bury these rewards within a skill tree. We are instead encouraged to explore and seek out a musician and then complete a small set of objectives. Expanding upon this are the 3 additional combat stances: Water, Wind, and Moon. Each stance has their own skill tree, allowing for a variety of enhancements. So far this sounds fairly typical. What separates Ghost of Tsushima from the norm is a prerequisite to gain access of these stances. If we observe or eliminate enough specific high-ranking officers, we gain access to a new combat stance. Even thematically, this lends itself perfectly to the idea that we are learning about our enemy and how to eradicate them from our lands. Ghost of Tsushima is not a perfect game. Despite its ability to avoid many tropes, it has the tendency to fall headfirst into others. But I can't deny that I am impressed with Sucker Punch making the decision to effectively build part of their skill tree into the core gameplay, instead of simply giving the player an extra half a dozen skill points for them to distribute at various intervals. Also, I think it's only fair for me to acknowledge the evidence of this type of hybrid skill tree present in other titles. Slowly but surely, it really does appear as if this skill tree is growing. It's clear by now that the skill tree has made a significant impact on the gaming industry. From being something more akin to a sapling in its early RTS days, it's grown into a gigantic oak, or in recent years, not too dissimilar to an arboretum. In truth, the thought of the skill tree withering and fading away is far from a concern. Its divergence from building one specific class in an RPG has evolved into crafting a character that fits the exact specifications of a boardroom full of game designers. And although its popularity carries with it the downsides of oversaturation, there is no denying that the implementation has brought with it excellent ways of illustrating character progression. But as I said at the start, innovation produces some of the best games. Perhaps it's time for the games market to rethink where it's assigning their tech points. Instead of opting for the safe and reliable strategy, maybe it's time for them to take a risk and try something new.